Howdy Rebels and Poweteers, and welcome back to another fascinating episode of Famicom Dojo. I'm your host for this episode, Sean Orange from Powit.tv. Last time we introduced the Famicom Disk System. Some of you didn't even know it existed, let alone what it had to do with gaming in North America. The answer, surprisingly, is quite a lot. Up until that point, games were typically released on cartridges, which contained read-only memory, or ROMs for short, so there was no inherent way to save game data. In 1984, Nintendo released the Data Recorder, which worked with some cartridge-based games such as Excite Truck and Mach Rider and allowed you to save custom tracks onto a standard audio cassette. Why not just use battery backup saves? At the time, Nintendo considered the cost too high to include on its cartridges, so instead it decided to develop the Famicom Disk System. Any games that required saving data was developed for this system instead of using a cartridge. Problems plagued the release of the Famicom Disk System in Japan, so an alternative was required for release in North America. The biggest problem was the disks themselves. Any bad sector or dirt that got into the unprotected area would render an entire game unreadable and would require rewriting or replacing the disk entirely. The next biggest problem was with the disk system itself. The band that runs the drive was not a standard size or elasticity and had to be sent back to Nintendo to be repaired. This was also a problem in authorized clones, such as Sharp's Twin Famicom. But that too is another story entirely.
Man,
I still have no idea what you're saying.
はいはい。じゃあ、どうだろうな、これ。
Who said that?
お、下本さん。
Meanwhile, the NES was having plenty of problems of its own. The copper contact pins on its VCR-style zero force slot, which is anything but, were prone to corrosion and bending.
Oh yeah.
However, within the first couple of years of its release, plenty of official Nintendo repair centers are cropped up around the country, so the infrastructure to support the disk system was already in place. By comparison, Nintendo of Japan has a policy of supporting its systems for 20 years after its initial release. This expired for the Famicom in 2003. Up until that point, people were able to send their disk systems or Famicoms in for repair, or have their disks rewritten or replaced entirely. In the meantime, Nintendo had to figure out a way to release its disk system games abroad. One of the first things it tried was to use a password system, such as in games like Metroid.
I've never seen this screen, because what's kill mode?
That's right, in the Japanese version of Metroid there was no Justin Bailey code. In every other Metroid game since, there's been a battery backup save, or an equivalent, to save your progress. Perverts. However, the password solution was not sufficient for all disk system games, so in 1987, 4 years after the release of the Famicom and just one after the release of the disk system, Zelda made its way to US shores on a battery backup save cartridge, completely freeing Nintendo of the need to market the disk system abroad. The NES was released during the Famicom Disk System development cycle, and some of its hardware specs proved they intended to release the peripheral in the US eventually, before all this happened. Don't believe me? I can prove it. Just take your NES,
Hey, put me
look
down.
in the bottom here and you'll see this flap.
What?
Just
Don't touch
pull it
that.
off,
Hey!
and you will see another piece of plastic covering the expansion port.
Oh man, this is so embarrassing.
Despite the now widely available battery backup, there were several disk system titles that were not released in a comparable cartridge format. The most notable example is the original Super Mario Bros. 2, which was later rebranded and retooled as Lost Levels for the Super Nintendo Super Mario All-Stars. However, many games did make it across the pond. Zelda 2 just came out in the Wii Virtual Console a few weeks ago, so it only makes sense to use it as our example. Let's take a look, shall we? Zelda 2 was basically remade for American audiences, going beyond the need to program it for the battery backup. The sound had to be entirely redesigned because the NES had no FM synthesis chip like the disk system. And because of the battery backup, the release of the disk system and the sound chip was unlikely. Also, because of the change in the NES pin configuration from the Famicom, it made it impossible to include the FM synthesis chip on each cartridge that would require it. Apart from the sound design, the differences between the disk system version and the NES version of Zelda 2 are pretty extreme. These differences are so entrenched, in fact, that the Japanese Famicom mini-series on Game Boy Advance, as well as the Japanese Wii Virtual Console versions, try to recreate the disk system experience over the cartridge-based one. While locations and characters remained the same, tiles were changed and experience points were rejiggered for the American version. For more in-depth coverage of this subject, check out our show notes on Powa.tv. Well, until next time, this is Sean Orange signing off for 4-Color Rebellion and Powa.tv. Enjoy!
ファミコン道場次回